Good evening and welcome to the Royal Opera House, both to the audience here in the Claw studio upstairs and also to all of you watching live at home wherever you are. My name is Clemency Burton-Hill. Now, you'd be hard pushed to find a stage in the world that hasn't played host to William Shakespeare. And indeed, the boards here in the main stage of the Royal Opera House regularly sees the work of William Shakespeare produced. Tonight, we're celebrating the Royal Opera's thrilling new production of Otello by exploring how Shakespeare's iconic works have been translated, transformed and reimagined for opera, ballet and the theatre. With us to talk about interpreting Shakespeare are three people who know better than almost anyone how to do it. They've created highly regarded productions around the world, and they are the theatre director Nicholas Hytner, the opera director Keith Warner, and composer Joby Talbot. Tonight, very excitingly, we're also going to be having some live music, and I'm delighted that Royal Opera Jetta Parker young artist Francesca Ciegina will be singing Desdemona from Verdi's Otello. Leading the panel discussion tonight is one of the greatest Shakespearean academics that we have, Jonathan Bate, who's also a Fellow of the British Academy. Please welcome Jonathan. Hello. Now, Jonathan, you've spent your illustrious career studying the Bard's work, and no doubt you've seen a fair few productions in your time. Just what is it that makes his work so appealing and enduring to audiences and artists around the world today?
Well, of course, the language is a huge part of it. But I think in the end, the answer to that is his extraordinarily profound understanding of the deepest human emotions, of love and desire, of jealousy, dealing with death. And because it's about the emotions, perhaps it doesn't entirely depend on the language. And that's why the language of music in opera and ballet can perhaps come to the essence of Shakespeare.
Well, we'll be talking more about how that happens. You've got some wonderful people on the panel tonight. What are you hoping to get out of them?
Well, I'm terribly excited, not least because The Winter's Tale is my favourite Shakespearean play, and Otello is my favourite Shakespearean opera, and these are the people who know these works inside out.
Happy days. Well, thank you very much indeed. We're looking forward to hearing more about that. Talking about the new production here at the Royal Opera House of Otello, it's going to be directed by tonight's guest, Keith Warner, and it'll be opening next month on the 21st of June on the main stage, and there'll be a chance to see it in cinemas all around the world on Wednesday, the 28th of June. So let's get a little taster. To find a screening local to you or to get tickets, just visit the Royal Opera House website. Now, tonight's Insight is presented in partnership with the British Academy. The Academy is the UK's national body for the humanities and social sciences, and it has a fellowship of over 1,000 leading academics. As a funding body, it supports academic research both nationally and internationally, and through its activities, it aims to stimulate public interest and understanding of the humanities and social sciences. To find more about their wonderful work, please do visit the British Academy website. Now, it's incredible to think that there are people watching around the world this evening from countries such as Canada, Brazil, the USA, Austria, Germany, Mexico, Russia, Portugal, here in the UK, and no doubt many more. And we would love for you to join in the conversation tonight. You can use the hashtag ROH Shakespeare, or you can use the comment section on YouTube, and there will be a chance to put your questions to our illustrious panel, so get your thinking caps on. I will be back later to put those questions to our panel, but for now, please join me in welcoming our very special guests, Nicholas Hytner, Keith Warner and Joby Talbot.
Well, if we think back to the origins of opera, it all began with the dramatisation of the great classical myths, stories such as Orpheus and Eurydice, Alcestis. So it was kind of inevitable that when, in the Romantic period, Shakespeare became a classic all around Europe, that great composers would look to Shakespeare as new source material. In France, there was Gounod with his Romeo and Juliet. There was Hector Berlioz, who fell crazily in love with an English actress, Harriet Smithson, who had played Juliet and Ophelia. And of course, he wrote his Beatrice and Benedict based on Much Ado About Nothing. Then in Italy, the great librettist, Arrigo Boito. You perhaps are not familiar with his Amleto, his Hamlet that he wrote for Franco Faccio. But you are, of course, familiar with his Falstaff from The Merry Wives of Windsor and his Otello, which we'll soon be seeing here at the Royal Opera House. Then, more recently, in the 20th century, in Britain, we had Benjamin Britten, Midsummer Night's Dream, and more recently still, Thomas Ades's The Tempest. Indeed, Keith Warner, who we'll be talking to tonight, has directed many, many Shakespearean operas. And that's before we even begin to think about the spin-offs. Did you know that two French librettists in the 19th century, Carré and Barbier, took the score of Così fan tutte and joined it to the language of Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost? And then the spin-offs like Delius's Village Romeo and Juliet, Bernstein's West Side Story, and on we go. In the case of ballet, perhaps not so many examples, but still some pretty famous ones. Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet, most famously, which of course, choreographed by Kenneth Macmillan, was a standard of the repertoire here with the Royal Ballet for many, many years. Then there was Frederick Ashton's The Dream, based on Mendelssohn's music, staged in 1964 here, along with a revival of Robert Helpman's Hamlet opera, ballet, I should say. And indeed, you can see the Ashton Dream live in cinemas from the Royal Ballet on June the 7th. But the most recent ballet adaptation was the 2014 Winter's Tale, an international collaboration with choreography by Christopher Wheeldon and the music specially composed by Joby Talbot. And that's what we'll be focusing on in the first part of this discussion. But perhaps before I start asking Joby about that, I could just ask each of you one question. Keith, you've done a lot of Shakespearean operas. What is it about Shakespeare in opera that keeps drawing you back to this repertoire?
I get asked, I suppose is the first thing. People sort of say, you know, we're doing a Shakespeare thing, let's ask him. It's the way it works. But I must say that I think it's a sort of fascination, maybe from a personal point of view, because I'm crazy about Shakespeare. I've spent a lot of time and money going to Stratford and going to the National Theatre, seeing Shakespeare whenever I can. And in fact, because in opera you work away from home a lot, I get these incredible pangs to see Shakespeare. And actually, I've recently quite often gone and seen it in German, in the Burgtheater in Vienna or wherever, in Berlin or various places. Because what happened with that, I think, is that one begins to see that Shakespeare's many different things. I mean, there is that thing for the Great Britain where the language is just beyond compare in any other field. But there's also the subject matter and, as it were, the bigger, almost philosophical world of Shakespeare, which I think was revealed to me more by the German theatre sometimes because of the language not being there. I mean, it's a great advantage not having to do the language for the Germans because you don't have to deal with all that stuff. But they often can see the play in a very, very rewarding, interesting way. And I think perhaps what links all of those is music. I mean, it's surely the poetry is a kind of music in Shakespeare, the cadence of things, the way ideas fit together are almost like a musical structure. And I guess it feels okay being an opera. Yeah. So fun to do.
Thank you. Now, Nicholas Hytner, you are an opera director. In fact, I think the first opera I ever saw was your Coronation of Poppaea when you were a third-year undergraduate and I was a first-year. But you've not, I think, directed a Shakespearean opera, whereas, of course, you have, as director of the National Theatre and previously at the Royal Shakespeare Company and elsewhere, directed a huge body of Shakespearean work. Have you kept away from Shakespearean opera because you think, in the end, there's no alternative but to do the real thing, that you can't actually have any substitute for the Shakespearean language and poetry?
I think, yeah, I'm not sure I've ever Oh, I have been asked to do Shakespearean operas, and the plays have, in the end, been the barrier between me and being able to understand or appreciate fully, to the extent that I've felt it possible to stage them, the operas I've been asked to think about. But as a spectator, I have no problem at all. As someone who knows the plays, I'm going to say something that sounds contradictory and banal. It feels to me that if you're making dance or opera out of Shakespeare, you have the inestimable advantage that you don't have to deal with his words, but that's also obviously a terrific disadvantage. I'm going to give you a concrete example, which is the last scene of the Wealden Talbot Winter's Tale, where, if you remember, because of, as soon as you start talking about Shakespeare, you have to talk provocatively. There is no accurate way of describing him, but because of a 14-year-old scam, because of a con trick, Shakespeare's able to set up a scene which has such mysterious resonance that it can, for instance, devout Christians, affirm to them their faith in the resurrection of the survival of the spirit and the resurrection of the body. That's not how it strikes me, but Hermione, hidden for 14 years from the guilty and grieving Leontes, is apparently miraculously restored to life, whereas in fact she's been hidden, I think rather sadistically, by her friend Hermione, Paulina, in order to punish Leontes. At the end of the play, semi-magically, because of a series of marvellous coincidences, the daughter thought lost of Leontes and Hermione is restored to both of them, Perdita. The last scene in the play is so extraordinarily complex and emotionally ambiguous. On the one hand, you have kind of symphonic lines from Paulina, "It is required you to awake your faith," which does seem to be a summons to some larger faith with a capital F. On the other hand, when Leontes sees what he thinks to be the statue of Hermione, one of the first things he says is, "She's much more wrinkled than I remember." And when he touches her, he famously says, "She's warm." Of course she's warm, it's the real Hermione. And the brilliant thing about the way Shakespeare writes is, at the same time, he can hit both registers. Faith with a capital F, but also wrinkles at the decay of the flesh and the warmth of the flesh. It's all there in the same scene. But the one thing he does not write about, the one thing he cannot bring himself, or decides not to bring himself, to write about in that final scene, is that there is one person definitively dead who cannot be brought back to life, however much you believe in whatever you decide to believe in. And that is Mamilius, the son of Hermione and Leontes, who died from shock as a result of Leontes accusing his wife of adultery and putting her on trial for her life. Mamilius is dead, totally dead, finally dead, never mentioned in the final scene. I think in a good production he kind of hangs over it. I've even seen a production where his ghost walks across the stage, marvellously. Hermione never says a word to Leontes. Another brilliant thing about Shakespeare, who doesn't say stuff to people. Leontes is overwhelmed to see Hermione again. All Hermione wants to do is talk to Perdita, her daughter. Feels kind of real to me. Whether Hermione will ever forgive Leontes for the loss of the child, and whether Leontes will at some point wake up and say, "What about these 14 miserable years I've just spent?" You don't know. It's left in the future. The play ends before you get to find out all that. Now, just to come to the ballet, the brilliant thing in the ballet, one of the many brilliant things in the ballet, which I admire inordinately, is that the statue of Hermione was a double statue of Hermione and Mamilius. And in the most, I cry as I remember it, in one of the most moving things I've ever seen on stage, once Hermione has come to life and gone off stage with Perdita, ignoring Leontes, Leontes touches the statue of the boy to see if he can bring the boy back to life, but the statue is stone, cold stone, doesn't come back to life. Now, you couldn't do that in the play. You absolutely couldn't do that in a production of the play, because the audience would be sitting there thinking, why does nobody mention the boy? Why, if there's a statue of the boy, why isn't anybody talking about him? Because words are so concrete.
Yeah,
so there you go.
I think that's right. I mean, I actually think there's also a very interesting technical reason why the boy doesn't come back, which is that I'm almost certain that the boy actor who played Mamilius is now playing Perdita.
Yeah,
and in that sense, he has come back. Now, Joby, we've got to come to you here. I think it is a stunning ending. The idea of a double statue, so imaginative. But the question that I was asking myself about that, and it's one I asked about the whole of the ballet, and I do have to say it is one of the most beautiful works of art I have ever seen. It is absolutely staggeringly beautiful, and it's on DVD. But you, the composer, Christopher Wheeldon, the choreographer, how does that work? Whose idea was the double statue? Or did you work together? How did it happen?
Well, thanks, incredibly nice of everybody. Thank you. When you have a really good collaboration on the go, when you can't remember whose idea was whose. And, Chris and I were holed up at Chris's place in New York, just kind of taking the play apart, putting it back together again, trying to work out how we could tell this incredibly complicated, difficult story, or number of stories really, how we could tell it using just movement and stagecraft and music. And we would discuss a scene, talk about what the salient points that were important to get across, the emotional arc of the different characters, and then I would say, well, I think I could do. I mean, one of the things we for example, one of the things that's very hard to show is without recourse to words is Leontes' descent into jealous madness, especially given that jealousy is such a inert, inward. Almost by definition, it's all about pulling into yourself and not externalizing the feeling. And of course, Shakespeare can do monologues. We know what's going on in people's heads because they're telling us. But we were trying to work out how we could show that Leontes is seeing the perfectly blameless interaction between Hermione and Polixenes in a completely different way. He's convinced, absolutely convinced, that they're having an affair. And we came up with this idea that we would see it once as it really is, and then see it again with a change of lighting state, and with exaggerated gesture and movement, as if it's through Leontes' mind. And this is something that I don't think we'd seen before on the stage in ballet, something that you can imagine well seeing in a movie, for example. And so we kind of, these are the kind of solutions that we began to come up with when we started talking. And then when we had a quite detailed scenography with quite specific timings that we found we actually kept to. I mean, literally, Chris would be like, okay, what happens in the scene? So, he sees her, he's convinced she's having an affair, so he'd go over one side of the room, he'd step, and then how long was that? I'd be like, 20 seconds. Okay, 20 seconds. It was quite as prosaic as that. And then we worked very, very hard on making sure that was a sound architectural structure for the overall piece. And the actual minutiae about who came up with what idea, I couldn't really tell you. It was such a kind of meeting of minds.
Well, that's the nature of true artistic.
Can I remember one small thing, which was evidence to me how carefully you'd both read the play? So it was, Jonathan will remember the line exactly, but there is an amazing image when Leontes starts to get crazily jealous about the spider at the bottom of the cup. Yeah. The spider is the image of kind of crazy jealousy, and lo and behold, in the big solo for Leontes when he goes crazy with jealousy, there's Edward Watson's freaky fingers doing spider movements. I could not believe how great that was.
Yeah. Great Addams Family.
Yeah. Well, the way that you transform the imagery into dance was extraordinary. I mean, right at the beginning, there's a wonderful moment where Leontes and Polixenes are remembering their childhood. We were as twin lambs that did frisk in the sun, and you just very briefly saw them as children playing like lambs, and then it transposed to the adult Leontes and Polixenes. Let's see a little clip from the first act of The Winter's Tale, the dark Sicilian court. The Winter's Tale is famously a play of two halves, the winter court of Sicily, and then the wonderful pastoral scenes in Bohemia. And I suppose musically, this was a wonderful opportunity for you to write in two completely different styles. There's all sorts of folk influences and so on with the country dancers. And did you particularly enjoy the second act?
I did, though. I mean, the tricky thing, I don't know, when you direct it, whether you feel the same way, but you get to the end of Act One, you think, okay, so we're on a roll here, and then you realise you're just a completely different play. You know?
Yeah, Bohemia is famously difficult, almost always terrible in a production of the play.
Well, I mean, it's funny. I mean, you watch TV comedy from 10 years ago. It seems dated.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty amazing that any Shakespeare manages to be funny after all these hundreds of years. But then again, we're not. When we're making a ballet or an opera out of it, you're not stuck with the words as they appear on the page. So it meant that we could kind of leapfrog some of the bits that are rather more difficult to. And of course, I mean, there's so much in Act Two which you wouldn't really want to try and show through movement. So we kind of stripped Act Two back to make it more of a lot less storytelling. Act One is very kind of about the storytelling, the narrative, and the emotional arc of the characters. But interestingly, it was, I think, the very starting point, and I should say that, I don't know if I'm allowed to say, but it was Nick's idea in the first place too. You speaking with Chris Wheeldon and gave us the idea to do it. Yeah. And I think the very first thing Chris said to me was that one of the things that makes the play so hard to put on is this complete difference in tone and characters and everything between what happens in Sicily or Sicilia and Bohemia. But that, monochrome versus technicolor disparity is bread and butter for ballet, which is an art form that thrives on big gesture and big differences.
Mm. Well, let's get a sense of that difference. We'll have a clip from the second act now. We've talked about the collaboration between composer and choreographer, but of course another key figure in a collaboration is the designer, and I think you could see from those clips that the design, the gloriously colourful design of the Bohemian scenes was designed by Bob Crowley, an essential part of the genius of that production. I'd like to turn to Keith now and ask you about designers. I wonder where you've got to with the question of design in Otello, and do you have do you go early in the process to your designer to work together, or how does that collaboration work?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that's any different from, I'm sure, what Nick would say about a play or anything. Of course, you have your own response to the play or the opera, and my response is normally, especially in pieces that are unfamiliar, I can't say that of the Verdi, is to listen to the music without reading the libretto, just so that somehow a world emerges in one's mind that turns into something visual. I think the relationship between music and the visual thing is immediate and intense, certainly for me. But exactly what was being said about Winter's Tale, I think it's very hard if you've got a really great collaboration with the designer to know where ideas come from or go to. As indeed with actors or singers. I mean, you are working through discussion and debate, not in any dictatorial way. And so it seems to me that as you start conversations, a conversation with the designer can even change these initial ideas you had about a piece, opera or not. And certainly when you've worked for a long time with somebody, which is true of Boris Kudlicka, who is designing Otello, you begin to get a wonderful kind of relationship, understanding, almost like a kind of human relationship you would have in life, about what your sensibilities are and the things you like. And also, I think, very important, how to break the things that you do, that you know how to do, that you do as tricks, that you know how to solve that problem. And it's sometimes very good to have people who say to you, no, let's try and find a different way of doing this. Let's not think. So I think you've got to be very open with one another. That's another thing. You've got to be able to, as in a good relationship, you've got to be able to say whatever you need to say to the person. And then something begins to emerge, and exactly how that happens, where that happens, why that happens, I think is the reason to get up every morning, if you're involved in theatre, because things are going to happen, and that's for sure. And sometimes they're terrible things and lead you off down the wrong alley for a while or whatever, and sometimes they're glorious things that just feel and know they're right. So, yeah, it's a very, very strange, symbiotic business.
Yeah, I think we on the screen at some point we'll be seeing some sort of preliminary images as the thinking evolves with Otello. Nick, you always obviously think very hard about design. One of the choices, though, that a Shakespearean stage director has to make is the choice between period costume and modern dress. I mean, famously, your Othello at the National was modern dress. It was sort of modern British squaddies in an office by the water cooler. You kind of couldn't quite do that in an operatic version, could you?
You can certainly, I think the importance of period is probably exaggerated. Shakespeare's plays, to whichever period they referred to, were essentially performed in the 1590s and the early 1600s as contemporary plays. So performing them as contemporary plays now feels to me to be no more controversial than performing them as period pieces. The interesting thing that I've always had to confront right at the beginning is how real should they be? And here's where I think there's a gulf between, on the one hand, spoken text, and on the other hand, opera and ballet. Opera and ballet are several degrees away from the reality we recognize as literal just by virtue of the form they play with. People don't dance, they don't dance to say they're jealous. They don't sing at the top of their voices to say they're jealous either.
Pentameter either, do you?
No, but I think iambic pentameter is not anything like as far from the supple realities of articulate speech as poor young actors are scared into thinking it is. The iambic pentameter is there to help you. It's not there as a scary thing that you somehow have to reach up to. If you speak Shakespeare's line, whether it's in verse or in prose, if you speak it for the sense, you will find, first of all, that the prose is given a very firm rhetorical structure, which you can observe and speak the sense of one at the same time. They feed into each other, they help you. Verse almost always emerges naturally if you speak the sense. And if you speak the sense and the verse is pulling away from you, that's something you can exploit. That is something that Shakespeare does. Othello felt to me, when I first started to talk about it with designers and with the two actors, they were there right in from the beginning. Adrian Lester as Othello and Rory Kinnear as Iago were all part of the initial discussions, and Vicky Mortimer, the brilliant designer. It struck all of us that it is a play, of all plays, rooted in quotidian reality. It's about real soldiers, a real army, finding themselves at a loose end after a war that doesn't happen. Everything that happens in Othello, which I think above all is a play about how quickly and easily an identity can be stripped apart. It's about Othello losing his sense of himself. Everything about it felt to us like it would be most powerful if set in a real world, a real army, real barracks, a real office where Iago, the ADC, to a general who's risen from the ranks, having trouble, actually, at a loose end with a woman, and he's useless with women. He's a middle-aged man who's never been married, really confused by what this young woman who he's been struck with in a coup de foudre is really about. Everything, it felt to me, would work best if it was done hyper-real. And the actors took the same approach. Both of them capable, particularly Adrian. Othello's verse quite often hits the heights, but always at moments of extreme emotional stress. The journey from almost Pintoresque naturalism, when Iago speaks to his wife, Emilia, the dialogue could almost have been written yesterday, to Now by Your Marble Heavens, which Verdi takes into as grand, and I'm getting the line wrong, my memory's always faulty, which Verdi takes into kind of huge operatic heights. That journey is encompassable by an actor acting, for want of a better word, real. Now, I don't think that you can or should attempt to act that real, that near to what we recognize as literal reality. I don't think you can do that if you're doing grand opera, and you certainly don't do it if you're dancing classical ballet. So that's the biggest difference, it seems to me.
Yeah, it is. I'm sure we'll push that discussion further. But of course, one aspect where Shakespeare does come close to the world of opera is when his characters start to sing. Famously, towards the end of Othello, as Desdemona is getting ready for bed, she sings a song, the Willow Song. And we're now going to see how Verdi and Boito adapted that scene in their Otello. So please welcome Yetta Parker young artists, Francesca Chiagina and repetitor James Hendry, to perform Desdemona's Willow Song from Act 4.
poco giunge Otello. Questo semplice suono finir. Il era nato per la sua gloria, io per
Thank you so much, Francesca. Well, Jette Parker, young artist and the star of the future we've just heard. Thank you so much. Absolutely beautiful singing. Where are we in Desdemona's world at that point? What's just happened?
To set it up, in Act 3, she's just gotten beaten down by Otello, basically in front of everyone. And he's accusing her of infidelity, and she has no idea. She's completely innocent. And so she's in shock and anxious and in a low mood, and we find her in Act 4 in her room, doing her nightly routine in a bit of a daze, as she does every night, with Amelia, her maid. And the story comes to her that her mother used to tell her of a maid named Barbara who loved a man and was abandoned. And this story, of course, aligns with her life in some ways. And so she repeats salce, salce, salce in a bit of a daze and a foreboding of his return home.
Why is Verdi so successful, do you think, in bringing that Shakespearean character to life?
I think with both Shakespeare and Verdi, I think both in their own ways have basically captured vividly the depth of human emotion and drama, and so they merge seamlessly in that way.
They certainly do. Well, we're very lucky. We're going to be hearing you sing for us again later on the utterly beautiful and heartbreaking Ave Maria. So thank you so much, Francesca. In the meantime, though, it is time to return to our wonderful panel. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Clemency. Look, Keith, I mean, that Willow song we've just heard, I mean, that's a perfect example of how the music and the voice can heighten the emotions and just absolutely capture how Desdemona is feeling at that moment in the play. But there are other moments in the Shakespearean drama, moments of psychological revelation, moments of sort of more inwardness, where it's surely more difficult to really sort of penetrate inside the characters. And how do you go about exploring, you know, these very complex characters, Iago and Otello, with your singers as you go into the process?
Well, again, you start with conversations. I mean, you start by discussing what's there in front of you. And of course, what Nick says is absolutely right, that what you have to discuss as well is not just the text in this case, but what the music is doing. And of course, you've got another thing in an opera house, because they tend to be large. And somehow what you do, I mean, which is another thing about cinema relays, what you tend to do, even in, say, the Olivier, would not necessarily always carry, maybe in Covent Garden, but you know, in some of the larger opera houses, say in America. So you have got this this business of how do you find a kind of bigness without exaggeration, without a kind of vulgar display, or again falling upon stock gesture, in order to explore the most intimate and extraordinary parts of human love, emotion, politics. And I think what you have to do is, I mean, I don't know whether this is exactly the same with some actors, but you just have to start from them and their response and feelings with the text, and then engender that into some sort of growth that is useful rather than, you know, that is immediate or a display, and then try and find some sort of way, technically, maybe, I don't know if that's exactly the right word, that it can read in a large space. But I think in Otello, and you can hear it here, and I don't know that it's different in the play for me. Certainly in your production, it wasn't different, which was that somehow the piece seems to become, to me, ever more a concentration on psychology, on what happens inside one, particularly in the opera, perhaps one person's mind, or within two or three people's minds, that actually it's like an implosion towards a point of crisis. And I think what's remarkable about the music there is actually the tightness of the harmonic structure and how little repeated billowing phrases just become a kind of repetition, just when, whether you say that was the original song and that was the original tune, of course you can have that debate, or whether this is what Desdemona is feeling and therefore changes what was originally there or not. It doesn't perhaps matter, but what does matter is that you feel this thing like a sort of iris closing in on somebody. And I think of all the Shakespeare tragedies, to me, the Othello is so surprising in that it is so domestic, that it comes down to sort of emotions that it doesn't matter what century you're in. I think you have an immediate, if you have had any kind of relationship, marriage, feeling about anybody, you know, it's immediately tangible. And it sort of closes down into your own mind as you view it, I think, in the audience.
Yeah, and I suppose part of the intensification in the Verdi is that you don't get the first act. You remember in Shakespeare's first act, it's in Venice, and there's a lot of political stuff, you know, being summoned to the Senate in the middle of the night. There's backstory, there's context, social and political context. Whereas Verdi bangs straight in with the storm, the arrival in Cyprus, and you don't get so much of that that sort of sense of the wider world. So the element of domesticity is perhaps intensified.
Yes, and maybe this is something you can't so much show now, except maybe in one way it is our world, is that the original play perhaps had more political resonance for Elizabethans, with the Moorish ambassador and the whole trying to spy against the barbarians of Barbary and all of that stuff. and what that meant to a contemporary audience than perhaps the immediate kind of political resonances in the play do for us. It just dawns on me that perhaps in the one way that the world's changed at the moment is that this business of identity, which you talked about, which is what I think really the piece, certainly the opera becomes about one man's identity and how it floats in a world. Maybe there are very, very good instances in people who come in as refugees or as just displaced persons within society now, which also particular resonances which Shakespeare seems to catch with such humanity of why you turn out to be this jealous, crazed maniac, because your sense of identity has been slowly lost.
Yes, but Nick, I mean, I suppose in our world, I mean, it is a problem, is it not, to show a play with a black man hitting his white wife and then killing her? Is that a particular problem for us in a different way to what it was in Shakespeare? Because I slightly think in the opera, precisely because of that distancing and formality that you get through the fact that, as you say, people don't sing in real life, whereas, especially perhaps in a modern dress production like yours, I mean, there's something troubling going on there.
Yeah, well, I think these plays change all the time. The play is only ever half the story. First of all, Shakespeare was an actor. He writes for other actors to complete the play. He only provides the text. So the way they convey themselves to you, the audience, is different from night to night, show to show, and most certainly from century to century. Yeah, that particular element of the play has a particular resonance now. But my own feeling about Othello and why it felt, to those of us who did the national production 3 or 4 years ago, so important to present it in our world, a real world now, is that it's the production history of the play that is obsessed by race, not the play itself, not the text itself. It's quite interesting how seldom anybody says anything racist in the play. In fact, the only people who say things racist about Othello are the ones who have perfectly good reasons to hate him anyway, and it is simply part of the texture of their hate. The Venetian Senate appoints him general of an expeditionary force to Cyprus to defend Cyprus against the Ottoman Empire without even pausing to congratulate themselves that they've been as broad-minded as they have been. Really interesting. Same Venetian Senate, same period, that is explicitly and viciously anti-Semitic about Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, is bluntly not racist in any particular way about Othello in the play Othello. Othello's vulnerable to Iago. Yeah, even when he starts to question why things have gone wrong, why Desdemona has turned against him, he says, maybe it's because I'm black, or maybe it's because I don't speak so well, I don't have the soft parts of conversation that Chamberis have, and I'm misquoting. Maybe it's because I've descended into the Vale of Years, yet that's not much, I'm not even particularly old. It's just part of the outsiderdom that engulfs Othello. He knows, what we know about him is that he's not even a commissioned officer. He came up from the ranks. He's had a life in the army. Desdemona appears to be the first woman he's ever had anything to do with. The person he trusts most in the world is Iago, who has fought by his side. And actually, preparing the production, I got very, very involved in talking to a Major General, a British Para Major General, who had commanded a division in Basra. And the first thing he said to me when we started to discuss the play was, well, I know where Iago's coming from, because the thing Othello hasn't done is promote the person who needed to be promoted. He's favoured the posh boy from the posh Oxbridge boy, from Florence instead, Cassio. There's all sorts of complex reasons why Othello's identity is so vulnerable to a man who, and you know, Iago's motives, so bluntly done by Boito, quite correctly, Boito gives Iago an aria which Verdi sets in the most terrifying fashion, which says very straightforwardly, I believe in a cruel God, I'm a nihilist. Iago in Shakespeare never has anything like that. Iago keeps giving you different reasons. His so-called motiveless malignancy is actually not motiveless, and it's Coleridge who points this out. It has a multiplicity of motives. He keeps giving you different reasons why he's got it in for Othello. He doesn't even know himself. He flies by the seat of his pants. I don't think at the beginning of the play he's even particularly Machiavellian. He's not even very good in Act 1. All his plans and stratagems in Venice come to nothing, or come to very little. So what does this add up to? It adds up to race is, I think, low on on the play Othello's agenda, but has been very, very high indeed. In the 19th century, it became about a man's return to essential African barbarism. And shockingly, that lasted a very long time. Olivier, famously, when he turned against Desdemona just before where the interval always happens, where he swears by the marble heavens that he's going to have revenge, Olivier ripped the crucifix that was round his neck from his neck and threw it away as if to say, now I'm black, now I'm African, now I'm Muslim again. That was 1964. That now feels like ancient history to us, doesn't it? I'm not going to say that's any less false to the play than I was 5 years ago. In 50 years' time, someone will be able to look at that NT Live broadcast that you in this house here, unfortunately not the people watching it on YouTube, which you just saw, and say, oh God, that's absolutely shocking. In fact, I rather hope they do, because that's what our job is, to interact with these great works of the past now, at this moment. Anybody ever tell you they've seen a definitive production, they're talking through their hat?
Well, this is, of course, the nature of how Shakespeare's imagination is so fertile that he can constantly be reinvented in new ways. And I mean, one of the things about Othello the Moor is that the primary meaning of the word Moor in Shakespeare's time was not black, but Muslim.
Yeah.
And the whole business that, he is Muslim, turned Christian, fighting against the Turk, and then there's some sort of sense of turning back. And one sort of imagines 21st century Othellos are going to be much more about the question of Islam than was the case in the day of Paul Robeson.
But it's not an issue in the play. It's not an issue in the play, is it?
I think it is. I mean, all that stuff about turning Turk and so on.
Yeah, but I think it's not foregrounded. And I think the way I will compare the way they describe Othello as the Moor to the way they describe Shylock as the Jew. They can't get through a scene without spitting out Jew as a pejorative time and time again. I think they call him Moor the way Hamlet calls himself Dane. It's a descriptor, not a pejorative term in the play.
Keith, just moving away from Othello for a moment. I mean, you've directed a number of Shakespearean operas, and there's a sense in every Shakespeare play, there are these great themes that composers, librettists have grasped onto. But just tell us about one or two of the moments where you felt that directing a Shakespearean opera has taken you to the core of a Shakespearean play.
Funnily enough, I'll pick up from Nick, because I've done recently, well, over the last 4 or 5 years, several places, Andrei Tchaikovsky's Merchant of Venice as an opera, which has the advantage that Ernest Bloch's Macbeth has, which I've also done, of actually using 90% of the Shakespeare text and setting that to music in English. So the music, strangely for me, in Andrei Tchaikovsky, who was of a sort of almost indefinite origin himself in terms of his own belief in himself. He was obviously a troubled gay guy, and about, again, identity. He writes music of such compassion for Shylock. It almost assuages some of the problems that maybe Nick feels about the way Shylock is treated in the play, and also because in the editing of the libretto, they've cut that down, except in one point where the chorus yelled Jew at him, and all of a sudden it is so clearly a horrendous moment because of the power of the music. And it's quite an interesting thing of how music can take a text and lead it in a certain direction. I think it's really a modern masterpiece. I don't think there's been many operas written in English since the Second World War that has the power of the Andrei Tchaikovsky, and around the world it's been. It's been.
Why isn't
very
it done here?
Well, it is coming.
Is it? Oh,
yeah, it comes at the end of the season.
I've never heard
of it.
Because I've never seen it.
It's here at Covent Garden from Welsh National. We did it, and it's coming. It's coming here for just 2 performances. But if you have any interest in modern opera, and if you have any interest in Shakespeare opera, definitely should see it. It's an amazing piece. And I took the other thing within the actual production of using an African-American baritone to play Shylock, which sort of complicates things and also kind of solves things in a funny sort of way. I mean, what it's about. And that, of course, there are many black Jews, and it's surprising how much ignorance you begin to get when people start saying, how can you have a black man as a Shylock? It's ridiculous, but there we are. It's a great piece. It's absolutely a great and interesting piece, and whether it will take away some of the feelings about the play that I completely understand people have, I don't know. But for me, it made it possible. I must say, the music has such compassion. It's extraordinary, such anger as well against, how we view an outsider. I mean, it's so clear.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, the history of opera is littered with unrealised dreams. Verdi spent all his life trying and failing to do justice to King Lear. Beethoven intended to follow Fidelio with a Macbeth, but only wrote 7 pages of sketches. And in the last 5 weeks of his life, Mozart started work on a Tempest. So I just wonder, coming back to you, Joby, after the triumph of your Winter's Tale, do you have any unrealised Shakespearean musical dreams? Is there another play you fancy scoring, whether for ballet or opera?
I think I'm still reeling from Winter's Tale, really. I mean, the two that kind of strike me, I would love to sort of think about having a go are the ones you've just shown me a very bad idea, Macbeth and Lear. Just because I think what's so exciting about Shakespeare's tragedies is just how far inside the kind of psyche of these interesting, complicated, flawed characters you can go. And it wasn't until until I actually set out trying to turn Winter's Tale into a ballet score that I realised just why people keep coming back to Shakespeare in this way, because there's just a richness in there, not just in the language, but in, I mean, it's quite extraordinary, really, the depths he goes to in terms of the characters and their relationships together. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, it's almost impossible to believe it was written so long ago and that it can have such a resonance to you now.
Yeah. Keith, you have directed Aribert Ryman's King Lear, which he wrote for Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, didn't
Yes.
he? Does that do justice to... I mean, there was, in the Romantic period, critics like Charles Lamb, William Hazlitt said, Lear is too grand even for the stage. When we see the storm in Lear's mind, we can only really understand that on the page. No actor can do justice to Lear, but perhaps opera can do justice to the grandeur of Lear.
Yes, I don't know if it does it justice, because it's sort of almost so great you can barely think about it. What I think it does is, like all good adaptations into whatever medium, film even, of any great work of art, is it takes a view of it. I mean, it takes a way in. It has a pathway. It's exploring, and I have to say, in Ryman's thing, I think it's the world of the violence in the play. I mean, it's incredibly harrowing 2.5 hours of a very strong but passionate, again, modern music that just takes no prisoners. But somehow you come out of the experience, I think, having perhaps more than in many productions. I think Lear is perhaps my favourite, Measure for Measure and Lear, my favourite plays of Shakespeare. And you know, you come out of that, and out of the storm sequence particularly, where there's offstage percussion instruments and things, more battered and more got at, almost sort of through your skin than you do or can do in the play, where I often find the storm, there's a real difficulty of how you do that, how you shout against that. Do you then use microphones? Do you think, whereas an opera singer's voice goes straight through that. But the whole thing of the Ryman thing is an unremittingly, I suppose, a little bit like the Brooke version of the play.
I was going to say, I mean, it's very resonant with
unremittingly bleak view of the world, and in that, you know, happily Germanic, but also I think a worthy way of looking at the world and looking at that play, or the world through that play, which is, I think, what one looks at in these adaptations is there a reason for it to be made into an opera or a film or whatever? And you could say that of any work of art. You know, there's been a lot of modern operas and things that are adaptations of things. Why do it? And if it fulfills a second's yes, yeah, I've got it, then I think it's worth doing.
Yeah. Now, Nick, you've not yet been tempted to direct a Shakespearean opera. Rather than ask you which Shakespearean opera in the existing repertoire you might be tempted to, let me ask a different question, which is there a Shakespearean play that sort of feels that it has operatic potential, but no major composer has taken it on, and perhaps you and, you know, maybe Joby or some other could have a go at it? I mean, do you think there is a sort of unrealised Shakespearean opera somewhere?
I've never thought of that. I've never thought about that, and I bet you they have. I bet you, I'd like to bet that. Are there any plays that haven't been adapted in some form or another into music?
I think you're right that most of them have. I mean, you know, whether it's for Comedy of Errors becoming The Boys from Syracuse.
Yeah, and that's really good.
And,
good.
you know, we've talked about Wagner's version of Measure for Measure.
I mean, there are a hell of a lot of Shakespeare operas. There are a hell of a lot of Shakespeare operas which are simply not good enough. Like, I'm going to say, Beatrice and Benedict by Berlioz. Oh my goodness, that is a shocker. It's got some good music. The comedy, the so-called comedy in Berlioz's Beatrice and Benedict makes Shakespeare at his comic worst seem hilarious.
But then where Berlioz, of course, is brilliant is when he turns Romeo and Juliet into a symphony. And
that's great.
And I mean, Joby, I mean, that I suppose for you as a composer, I mean, I think that sort of process of capturing the emotional arc of a work of drama and turning it into another medium, I mean, that must be incredibly exciting for you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I don't know, Berlioz, I don't think you'd necessarily put a French person in charge of making anything funny, would you? At the best of times. I think that's the thing, though, isn't it? How do you take the Shakespeare structure and turn it into a musical structure that works? And it's interesting that Berlioz abandons words altogether in so doing.
Yeah. And Keith, I mean, so you've been through much of the repertoire. Does the Wagner tempt you? Oh
God, no! I was offered that to do that in America, Liebesfibel, based on Measure for Measure. You know, it's such a distant adaptation of the play as really not to count. It's absolutely ghastly, I think, and has no merit in it other than thinking, thank God this guy found a way of writing really great operas, you know, for himself and for us. No, I'm very keen. I'm very, very keen on the Samuel Barber, Antony and Cleopatra, which nobody has done for over here.
I'd be fascinated to see. I'd be absolutely fascinated to see.
Would you know something? You'll hate this, but I have trouble with the play. It's one of the plays that always loses me somewhere, my interest, and then it picks up again when she's going to die. You know, I mean, always that sort of thing. And I have a feeling that the way that's done and some of the choices he's made, the way the chorus is used, it really could be a great piece, and nobody's really grabbed that and done it.
Well, I think that's a terrific answer, because surely for its soaring poetry, you know, Antony and Cleopatra, and indeed the vast canvas on which it's portrayed, it is in many ways Shakespeare's most operatic play. So let us hope you do that and that you bring it here to the Royal Opera House. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and we're going to have audience questions in a moment. But before we do, let's just return for a moment to Otello, to the tragic figure of Desdemona. It's time now to hear once again from Francesca Chiagina and James Hendry accompanying. And this is, in contrast to the Willow scene, this is the Willow song, this is a different kind of voice. It's the Ave Maria, obviously Verdi and Boito writing in Catholic Italy as opposed to Shakespeare writing in Protestant England. The Ave Maria towards the end, so an innovation in the text, but from the same segment towards the end of the opera, Desdemona, her heartbreaking prayer before going to sleep on the night of her murder.
Grazia, eletta fra le spose, le vergini sei tu, sia benedetto il frutto, o benedetta, di tue materne viscere, Gesù.
della morte
wonderful musicians, Francesca Chiedina singing Desdemona and James Hendry, the repetitor. I don't know if you can catch it on the camera, but there are a few glistening eyes on this panel. Absolutely beautiful. Well, thank you so much to all of you for getting in touch and being part of the conversation this evening. Fantastic to have such an engaged audience. We've heard from lots of people here in the Claw studio upstairs, but also from all around the world. And I'm now sort of going to fill Jonathan's shoes, not that they're fillable, obviously, and I'm going to now include you as part of the panel and ask some of these questions. Our first of which comes from Inez. This was from social media, and she's asking, is it easier to create a score? This one is for you, Joby, obviously, when the inspiration is a text. What are the challenges?
Is it, well, I mean, I must say, having written Winter's Tale, when I came to write my first opera a couple of years later, it was a great relief to actually have words with which to tell a story. I mean, that does help. I mean, I guess it is. If you're putting, I think theatrically, having a great narrator in the way that Shakespeare is obviously a great help. But then, of course, you can't follow the music in its kind of logical way. It's not like writing a symphony or a sonata where you have your different musical themes and you play with them and they kind of collide and they work themselves out and, in a nice sort of logical framework. You have an illogical story take you in all different paths and directions, and you have to somehow be true to that whilst at the same time making something that structurally works. Because if it doesn't work structurally, musically structurally, I mean, it usually just ends up being boring. And of course, boring is the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, we don't want boring.
No.
Can't accuse Shakespeare of being boring, ever. This is a question from our studio audience, and I suppose it's for Keith and Nicholas, really. What top tips would you give to young actors and performers when preparing to perform Shakespeare? Nick, I'll start with you. What top tips for young actors?
Don't treat Shakespeare any differently from the way you would treat anything else. The biggest barrier is fear and the mystery that is created around the performance of Shakespeare. You need to be imaginative, articulate. You need to believe that the character you're playing exists and speaks the way she speaks. They tend to be, not all of them, there are characters with giveaway names like Dull, but they tend to be very, very clever, very imaginative, emotionally available people that Shakespeare writes about. And that's why they speak in such an interesting fashion. Believe in that, work out the sense of it, think first. Feeling in Shakespeare, it seems to me, in spoken Shakespeare, is a consequence of thought. Don't slather it with generalized emotion. Work out what you're saying, work out what it means, make sure you think as quickly and imaginatively as your character thinks, and the rest will follow. But you don't need to worry about all the things that, people will scare you with. Worry about. You don't need to know what a caesura is. You'll be doing one anyway if you speak the sense of the line.
Wonderful advice to the players, worthy of Shakespeare, I might add. Thank you very much.
Hamlet's advice to the players is as good as it gets, so look that up.
Thank you. Keith, what are your thoughts?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, it's like Antoninato was saying, no more masterpieces. You simply can't, in a rehearsal room, work on a masterpiece. You work on this thing in front of you that you're trying to discover, that you're trying to bring alive according to your feelings, the actor's feelings, and perhaps there's somewhere hovering kind of relevance, I don't know, to the people who are going to watch it. But I think just don't be afeared. I suppose if on the opera side, I think you need to get a fantastic technique, work on that as something completely separate, but much more important, get a fantastic life and a complex and interesting time in life. So you've got something to bring when you come to the rehearsal room to put into these fantastically imaginative things. I mean, I believe more and more, and I think this is what Nick was saying really, that imagination is a muscle and it needs constant exercise, reading, going to art galleries, enjoying other forms of performance. These divisions between opera and theatre and ballet and concerts and rock music, they just simply exist in some marketing mind somewhere. It's all about expression, it's all about imagination, and go for it.
Joby, can I just ask you, do you feel that classical musicians in general, if not necessarily opera singers, do they suffer from that more than other performers, in the sense that the training is so rigorous, that they're athletes in a way, that from such a young age they're expected to do basically nothing but hone that technique and practice, sometimes at the expense of getting a fabulous life?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, traditionally more so than now. I think it's changing. I mean, when I was growing up in this country, you either were one thing or the other. Either you were, you were a classical musician or you were another kind of musician, and I never really understood that. I mean, it's like you say, it's like hybridization in horticulture. If you can draw something from somewhere and something from somewhere totally different, marry the two things together, you can create something new and strong and extraordinary. And I think there is maybe a tendency to focus too much on technique, because yes, as you say, I mean, if you have nothing emotionally to draw on, then you can be the best performer, singer, whatever in the world, but it's not going to be very interesting.
Again, we come back to that avoid boredom at all costs thing. Jonathan, I'd love your take on this. It's obvious why an actor or a singer needs to come at that character as a real human being. As an academic, as a great Shakespeare scholar, are they real to you?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense I feel I know them inside out. I've lived with them, read the plays, seen the plays, taught the plays for years and years and years and years. But at the same time, Shakespeare is a consummately self-conscious artist. Again and again in Shakespeare there'll be a moment where a character will say something like, if this were seen upon a stage, it would not be believed. And he likes to draw attention to his own artifice. And I think that is something that is really important, that the real kind of gift of Shakespearean art is that sense that you're simultaneously feeling, yes, these are real people, this is real life, but then at another level, no, this is a kind of thought experiment, and we are actually in a theatre. But then, of course, Shakespeare will step back and say, well, actually, all of life is like a kind of theatre. We are all players, the 7 ages of man.
Absolutely.
Can I ask Jonathan a question? Because I think it's something that I'm really interested in, and I know that he has thought about a lot. That Ave Maria, I think you have written very interestingly about the old religion being a memory all through Shakespeare's plays. How much is that latent in Shakespeare himself, a woman saying the Ave Maria?
I think latent is the key word. I mean, there's no doubt, Shakespeare's parents were born before the Reformation. Shakespeare's Warwickshire was full of recusant families. I don't actually think Shakespeare himself was a closet Catholic. We'll never know that for sure. But there's absolutely no doubt that the old religion is just there below the surface through all his works. And it is the old religion. I mean, sort of famously in Hamlet, young Hamlet goes to university at Wittenberg, which is Martin Luther's university, the centre of Protestantism. But old Hamlet comes back from purgatory, something that was distinctly Catholic and that the Protestant Reformation abolished. And I think one of the things about the old faith that fascinated Shakespeare was the importance within it of performance, of prayer, of worship as a kind of theatre. And in a sense, I think that's what is being plugged into at that Ave Maria moment.
Yeah.
Nick, I loved your point earlier about the fact that these plays were always contemporary. We've had a question from the studio audience here to say, how will virtual reality and augmented reality impact future performances and adaptations of Shakespeare's world? Thinking that that's the reality of where our contemporary world is headed.
I have a really straightforward answer to that, which is that as the rest of the world, as the rest of entertainment becomes more digital and more virtual, the audience in the theatre will find greater and greater value in the live experience. Real people in the same room, telling a story, no nonsense, sure, fine bits of frippery around design and so forth. The big plus of the digital revolution for those of us who work in live performance is, and this is an observable fact, people are more and more, and particularly the young who spend their whole time hunched over a screen, more and more interested in experiencing it live, whether it's some guy with an acoustic guitar in a room on top of a pub, or whether it's Verdi's Otello at the Royal Opera. That has become the irreducible desire.
Yeah, I think the millennials call it gives them all the feels. I think we can do with that. It gives them all the feels. Very quickly, Joby, perhaps you could answer this one. It's another one from social media. What do dancers in particular love about Shakespeare?
I think it's coming back to the same things before. It's just being able to fight. I mean, Ed Watson's performance as Leontes in Winter's Tale. I mean, that was a role that was created for him, and he's absolutely bringing every ounce of his extraordinary theatrical capability as a dancer to bear. I mean, it's a great example of how he has the most amazing, extraordinary technique. I mean, the way he can lift his leg above his head without even seeming to notice. But it's all about the emotion, and he's brought every ounce of his emotional creativity to bear on this role, and I mean it's just a gift. I think it's just a gift to any performer, really, to be able to. I mean, there's a reason why actors love acting it. It's just everything you could possibly want to do in creating a role is the raw material is there for you to do it.
It is certainly there. I'm going to be very mean. Lou from social media has asked a question. I'm going to make you answer in one word because we need to wrap it up soon. The question being, what does Shakespeare mean to you? Jonathan Bate.
Never ending.
We'll take that as one word. Joby Talbot.
Extraordinary.
Nicholas Hytner.
Theatre.
Keith Warner.
Aspiration.
There you go. Well, I could talk to you all night about this. It's been wonderful to hear all your insights. Thank you so much to our fabulous panel and all of their insights and expertise and all the joy that they've brought us tonight. Very sadly, that is all we've got time for. But tonight's event was presented in partnership with the British Academy. That's the UK's national body for the humanities and social sciences, and it's part of their Literature Week. Now, if you'd like to find out more about the British Academy's work or about Literature Week events or many more, please do have a look at their website. Speaking of the website, earlier we heard about that Tchaikovsky version of Merchant of Venice, directed by Keith, which is coming to the Royal Opera House on the 19th and 20th of July. And apparently there are some tickets still available on the website, so go and snap them up. That's if our panel don't get there first. And don't forget that you can, of course, see Keith's brilliant new production. I say that with confidence because I know it will be brilliant. Production of Otello, here on the main stage of the Royal Opera House. It opens on the 21st of June and you can see it in cinemas on the 28th of June all around the world. So do check the Royal Opera House website for more details. All that remains is for me to say a massive, huge thank you to all of our guests this evening. Jonathan Bate, Keith Warner, Joby Talbot, Nicholas Hytner, Francesca Chiegina and James Henry. But also a thank you to you, our audience, here in Covent Garden, but also watching all around the world. Thank you very much indeed. Good night.